The small brass bell above the door jingled softly as Clara Evans stepped into the gourmet grocery store on Ashford Street, her boots leaving faint impressions on the slate-tiled floor still damp from the morning rain. She paused just inside, brushing a damp strand of honey-blonde hair from her cheek, her eyes adjusting to the warm lighting that cast a golden glow across the marble counters and wooden shelves lined with imported oils, fresh bread, and gleaming packages of artisan cheeses. Clara, 28, wore a weathered gray coat cinched at the waist, a hand-woven scarf loosely knotted at her neck, and carried a cloth tote bag faded by time but cared for with gentle precision, each repair stitched with patient, invisible love. She moved quietly, almost reverently through the store, pausing now and then to examine a jar of preserves, or the handwritten labels on blocks of cave-aged cheddar arranged like sculpture on polished granite. Her presence didn't command attention. Rather, it invited misjudgment. She had the kind of beauty that wasn't loud. Porcelain skin, graceful posture, a mouth that looked as though it could smile warmly, even if it currently did not. Her expression was focused, her eyes flicking thoughtfully between items as if recalling something more than prices or flavors. A middle-aged woman with a designer bag gave her a brief glance, and then turned away, subtly shifting her purse to the opposite shoulder. Behind the cheese counter, a young store clerk named Becky whispered something under her breath to her coworker, then leaned forward just slightly, eyes narrowing. Clara stopped in front of the sample tray, 5 small cubes of goat cheese, each pierced with a single toothpick, arranged like offerings beneath a small sign that read, "Try me." She reached out slowly, not to eat one, but to gently roll it between, her fingers feeling its texture, lifting it near her nose, closing her eyes for a brief moment. It was a gesture not of hunger but of knowledge, an instinctive motion like a pianist brushing a key to feel its weight. Becky stepped out from behind the counter with deliberate sharpness in her heels and called out, "Samples are for customers, Mom, not for people just passing through." Clara opened her eyes, calm and composed, the cube of cheese still untouched in her hand, and looked up. Not with defiance, but with something quieter, deeper, dignity. Clara didn't flinch at the clerk's tone. She simply returned the cube of cheese to the tray with delicate precision, her fingers brushing the toothpick aside as if it were a relic rather than a disposable stick. Her gaze lingered for a moment, not on Becky, but on the cheese itself, as if questioning whether its integrity had been compromised by the environment, not her. Becky crossed her arms, shifting her weight with the kind of posture that turned mild irritation into performance. "Are you planning to buy anything?" she asked louder now, so that the woman browsing balsamic vinegars 3 feet away could hear. Clara met her eyes but did not raise her voice. "I was considering it," she said evenly. "I'm sensitive to rennet. I needed to feel the texture before tasting. Some soft cheeses include hidden animal enzymes. This one seemed worth asking about." Becky blinked, thrown momentarily off script, but recovered fast with a scoff. "You don't need to pretend you're some kind of expert," she said, gesturing vaguely at Clara's coat. "We've had a few people come in lately thinking they can sample their way through dinner." Clara's fingers brushed the edge of the tray again, not in defense, but in some small attempt to ground herself in something physical, tangible, while her cheeks warmed, not from shame, but from that uniquely civilized kind of humiliation, where one is reminded that in certain rooms being correct is not nearly as important as being assumed worthy. She took a step back. "I wasn't pretending," she said, quieter now. "I simply—" But the sentence trailed off, not because she lacked the words, but because she understood instinctively that they would not be heard. The woman at the vinegar display turned slightly, pretending to examine a bottle more closely, but Clara could see her eyes dart in their sockets. Interest. Judgment. Becky, sensing attention, pressed forward. "Look," she said, her tone clipped and falsely reasonable. "If you're not here to shop, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We have policies, hygiene issues, and our samples aren't meant for lingering." The word lingering fell like a gavel. Clara glanced at the tray once more. The cube sat untouched, perfect, sterile, as if daring her to reach again. She didn't. Instead, she took a small step backward, drawing her coat tighter around her waist, a subtle signal of retreat. But Becky misread the gesture entirely, interpreting it as resistance. "I'm serious," she snapped. now stepping fully between Clara and the display. You can't just hang around touching food, acting like you belong here. Clara blinked slowly, her posture straightening. Her voice was soft but clear. Why would you assume I don't? Becky laughed dryly. Because this isn't a shelter. It's a curated shopping experience. And frankly, people like you make others uncomfortable. Clara stood perfectly still. For a second, only the hum of the refrigeration units could be heard. Then she said, with the barest note of exhaustion, "People like me." Her voice held no tremble, only an ache, subtle but devastating. Becky tilted her head. "Yes," she said, undeterred. "Wandering in, picking at free food, asking strange questions. We have cameras, you know." The phrase came out like a threat, but also like a child bluffing with an empty hand. Clara turned her gaze to the back wall of the store, where a framed photo hung, showcasing the founders in front of the original location. Her eyes traced it for a long moment. Her throat moved slightly, but she said nothing. "Is there a problem here?" came a voice from behind the counter. One of the older managers, James, in his late 50s, had emerged from the office, clipboard in hand, eyes already narrowed. Becky turned to him eagerly, pointing toward Clara. She's been loitering, touching samples, didn't want to buy anything. Then she started acting like she works in dairy. Clara took a breath, then stepped aside. "You don't need to explain me to him," she said quietly. "I'm not trying to disrupt anything." But James, whose eyes had settled not on Clara, but on Becky, didn't speak right away. His expression flickered as if some half-formed memory scratched at the edge of recognition. Clara, catching the look, met his eyes for a second too long. Then, without another word, she turned and walked slowly toward the back of the store. Not hurried, not ashamed, just tired. Her footsteps were soft, almost ghost-like against the polished floor. The other customers resumed their browsing, but with a newfound silence. The kind that often settles when something is past, not quite a scandal, but something uncomfortable and real. Becky muttered under her breath and returned to straightening the cheese display, her jaw tight, her cheeks flushed not with victory, but something closer to unease. James stood a moment longer, the clipboard forgotten in his hand, eyes still following Clara's retreating form, as if trying to remember where he'd seen her before. And more importantly, what he'd failed to notice. Clara continued walking, passing the dry goods aisle where paper-thin crackers were arranged in clean, vertical stacks, then turned slowly toward the back corner where the floral section transitioned into the employee entrance. Marked only by a muted, gray door with a discreet sign. Authorized personnel only. Her fingers brushed the wood for a second, as though touching it could tether her to something stable. She didn't open it, she simply stood there, silent, gathering breath, staring at the small, circular smudge near the handle where countless hands had left behind oil and intention. Behind her, the sound of footsteps approached, sharp, impatient ones, and Becky's voice, now louder and more performative, rang through the quiet space. "You can't be back here!" she barked, her voice pulling the attention of a few curious shoppers from behind the pastry case. "This is private. You can't just wander around. Are you trying to sneak into the back?" Clara turned slowly, her face calm but unreadable. "I wasn't sneaking. I was standing." Becky rolled her eyes, now standing just a few feet away. "I don't care what you call it. You're making people uncomfortable. And frankly, this is starting to look like trespassing." Clara tilted her head slightly, her lips parting, but again, she didn't reply immediately. There was something in her expression that gave pause. Not fear, not defiance. Something quieter. Something like restraint. Then, just as Becky raised her voice again, another figure emerged from the rear hallway. An older man in a white apron and thick glasses, his hair salt and pepper and combed neatly back. He paused mid-step when he saw Clara. For a long second, he didn't speak. His name tag read Allen, and he'd worked at this location longer than anyone else on staff. He'd seen owners come and go, managers cycle through, food trends shift, and prices climb. Clara looked at him, and a hint of something flickered in his eyes. Not recognition exactly, but memory. His eyes traveled from her face to the tote bag at her side, specifically the embroidered edge near the zipper. A single stitched initial, faded but unmistakable. E. Alan took a small step forward. "Miss," he said quietly, "do you need assistance?" Clara's lips softened just slightly, but before she could answer, Becky interrupted with exasperation. "Alan, it's fine. She's leaving. She's already been warned." Alan didn't look at Becky. His gaze remained on Clara, and when he spoke, it was careful. "I think maybe we should call Mr. Evans." Becky scoffed. "Mr. Evans? Why would we call—" But then she stopped. Her eyes narrowed. "Wait, why would we call him?" Clara looked back toward the sample tray near the cheese counter, then down at her tote. With a quiet, deliberate motion, she reached into the inner pocket and pulled out a small, flat leather card case. She opened it, not for dramatic effect, but with the gentle decisiveness of someone doing something they've done before. Something that feels both necessary and quietly final. From the sleeve, she drew a black access card with a silver strip and a narrow company logo embossed at the bottom. Evans Market Group, Executive. Becky stared at the card but didn't speak. She looked at Alan, who gave her a glance that was not smug, but rather resigned. He had already begun to understand what was unfolding. Clara didn't move closer. She didn't raise her voice. "I don't need to speak to Julian," she said calmly, referring to the company's chief executive. "He's in meetings all day. This isn't his problem." Then she paused, letting the silence expand around her, and added, "It's mine." Becky's face contorted for a moment, trying to recalculate her place in this scene, still hoping to claw back some sense of control. "If you work here," she said, "you should have identified yourself from the start. You can't expect us to treat everyone like royalty just in case they turn out to be someone important." Clara looked at her then, not with anger, but with something heavier, slower, like the tired gaze of someone who's heard that same logic used to defend cruelty too many times. "I never asked to be treated like royalty," she said. "I asked for a moment of decency." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Becky shifted, uncomfortable now, her arms folding tightly across her chest. Alan cleared his throat. "Clara Evans," he said softly, as though testing the name aloud. "I remember your father used to come in here with you on Sundays. You'd sit on the cheese counter while he worked inventory." Clara nodded. "This was the first location. He built it with his hands, and I helped repaint the walls when I was 12. Her eyes moved slowly over the shelves. "And now we've got 28 locations across 3 states, but none of them mean anything if this one forgets who it is." Behind them, a small cluster of shoppers had gathered. Not crowding, not filming, just standing quietly, drawn by the tone, the mood, the strange stillness in the air. Becky, who had been so sure just minutes ago, now seemed unsteady, like a chair with one leg shorter than the rest. "No one told us you were coming," she muttered, as if that might shift the blame elsewhere. "That's the point," Clara replied. "I didn't want to be expected. I wanted to feel what it was like to stand here, the way anyone would, to see if it still felt like ours." She paused, looking around. "It doesn't." Alan moved more than he cared to admit, took off his glasses and wiped them slowly. Becky opened her mouth, but whatever came next would be too little, too late. Clara turned without another word and walked back toward the front of the store. Her pace wasn't fast, but it was steady, like a decision had been made, the kind that doesn't need announcement, only action. Clara did not leave the store. She walked toward the cafe corner near the front window, where the sunlight spilled through the tall panes and fell across the smooth wooden benches like melted gold. It was the same space that had once held 2 small tables and a chalkboard menu her father had handwritten every week in wobbly script, his fingers still stained from work in the back storage room. Now it had been reimagined as a sleek espresso bar, sterile and over-designed, serving $8 lattes in cups so thin they cooled before the first sip. She sat on the edge of the bench, not to rest but to wait. Composed, calm, the access card tucked back into her coat pocket. Out of sight, irrelevant now. Behind the counter, Becky was pacing in tight lines, her voice hushed now but clipped with worry as she murmured into the store's internal phone line. Alan had gone back into the rear hallway, not out of fear, but out of respect, and a kind of quiet loyalty only time can cultivate. The customers, meanwhile, had returned to browsing, but the atmosphere had shifted. Something unspoken had been introduced into the air like static before a summer storm. Clara sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze unfocused. Not angry, not plotting, simply remembering. There was a stillness in her that unsettled people, the kind of presence that made it hard to justify cruelty even in retrospect. The silence around her wasn't passive, it was conscious. It made others feel loud. Eventually, a young employee named Lacey, barely 20, approached cautiously from the coffee bar. Her apron was too large for her frame, and her hands trembled just slightly as she held out a ceramic cup. "Miss Evans," she said quietly, "I made you the chamomile tea from the blend you introduced 2 years ago. It's still in the system. I thought maybe it would—" She trailed off. Clara looked at her, and something in her expression softened. She took the cup gently, her fingers brushing the girl's wrist in a gesture that wasn't condescending but human. "Thank you, Lacey," she said, her voice low but warm. "You remembered." Lacey nodded quickly and stepped back, the way someone does when exiting a sacred space. Clara sipped the tea. It was too hot, but familiar. That detail, a small act of recognition amid the noise, reminded her of why she had come today, why she had refused to send someone else in her place, why she had chosen to walk these aisles with her name unspoken, her title stripped away. She wanted to feel the truth in the bones of the business, not the reports, not the metrics, not the filtered updates. The truth. And it had arrived, unfiltered, a sting across her cheek, a wall of suspicion in place of welcome, and one young girl with trembling hands offering tea like a balm. For a moment, Clara closed her eyes. She remembered the day this location opened. She had been 9 years old. Her mother, who passed away just a few years later, had cut a ribbon with golden scissors while Clara held one end of the velvet cord and smiled too wide for photographs she'd never see. She remembered the first evening rush, how she had stacked boxes of crackers taller than herself just to help, how her father had whispered, "This place is for everyone, even the quiet ones." And she remembered believing him, believing that something built on purpose and kindness would carry those values forward even as it grew. But now, sitting in the most polished corner of that same store, being treated like a liability in the name of efficiency, she understood how easily vision could be traded for performance. It wasn't malicious. That was the hardest part. No one had tried to destroy what the store had once stood for. They had simply stopped looking for it. They'd replaced substance with signage, welcome with branding, knowledge with control. And in doing so, they'd let the soul of the place drift toward the edges, until even those who had once belonged, like her, felt like intruders. The worst part wasn't being insulted, it was being forgotten. She set the cup down slowly and rose from the bench, not because she was finished, but because it was time. This wasn't about one store. It wasn't about Becky or her clipped tone. It wasn't about the cube of cheese or even the slap that still echoed somewhere deep in her skin. It was about the quiet erosion of something that had once been rooted in meaning. Clara straightened her coat, ran a hand over her scarf to smooth it, and turned toward the customer service desk. The manager was watching her approach with a mix of curiosity and thinly veiled discomfort. He stood straighter as she reached the counter, his fingers twitching, as if unsure whether to offer a handshake or a defense. She didn't force him to choose. She simply asked, "Can you print the store schedule for next week? I'd like to see the coverage pattern, particularly in training and customer-facing roles." He blinked. "Sorry, I'm Clara Evans," she said. "Daughter of Thomas Evans, legacy shareholder, current director of internal brand experience. And if you can spare 10 minutes, I'd like to walk through your onboarding process and shadow a team lead. If this store is to carry my name, I need to understand where it forgot its values." He stood frozen, the reality settling into his chest with the slow, undeniable weight of consequence. Clara didn't smile. She didn't gloat. But in her stillness, there was a promise. Not of punishment, but of return. A turning back towards something forgotten. Not for her sake, but for the sake of everyone who'd ever walked through these doors and deserved more than suspicion. It wasn't until nearly 40 minutes later that the atmosphere inside the store shifted again. Not with a loud interruption or dramatic entrance, but with the quiet arrival of a man who walked like someone used to being invisible until it was time not to be. Julian Evans stepped through the sliding doors of the store he had helped expand into a multi-state brand, dressed not in a tailored suit, but in dark slacks and a muted navy sweater that revealed nothing of his title but everything of his control. His jaw was sharp, his eyes clear, his expression unreadable, and yet his presence drew attention like gravity. The assistant manager who had printed the schedule for Clara barely had time to exhale before Julian approached him. Not with aggression, but with absolute calm. "Where is she?" he asked simply. The man stammered something about the break room, about Clara asking for training documentation, and Julian just nodded once before walking in that direction without waiting for permission. In the back corridor, the lights buzzed faintly above cold tile, and from a partially open office door, Clara could be seen sitting at a metal table, reviewing a printout of store policies with a red pen and a pad of notes. She didn't look up when he entered. "You came," she said, not surprised. "Alan called," he replied. "Said your face looked like someone had carved silence into it." That made her smile, barely. "I didn't ask him to," she said. "I know," Julian answered. "That's why he did." He stood across from her, arms crossed, taking her in. Not just her physical appearance, though he noted the faint pink hue still lingering on her cheek, but the way she sat. Shoulders upright, eyes steady, one foot anchored behind, the chair leg like she wasn't going anywhere. "How bad was it?" he asked after a pause. "It was honest," she replied. "Brutal in its smallness." She slid the annotated printout toward him. "But not irreparable." He picked it up and scanned it. "You came to test the culture," he said aloud, more to clarify for himself than her. "And the culture flinched." "No," Clara corrected gently. "The culture revealed what happens when no one's watching." Julian was silent for a moment. Then, "And now what?" Clara exhaled through her nose, slow and quiet. "Now we remind them someone is." She stood gathering the papers, the lines between family and leadership blurring with each movement. "I want every regional manager here by Friday. I want Becky reassigned, not fired. Let her work logistics for 3 months and see the business from the supply side. I want Lacey promoted to floor training. She has instincts." Julian watched her, something stirring behind his eyes. "You're not angry?" he said. "You should be." "I was," Clara admitted. "For 10 minutes. Then I realized anger's too easy. This place was my childhood. That wasn't just cheese back there. That was memory." Her voice grew quieter. "And I won't let that memory curdle into shame because someone forgot what welcome means." Before Julian could reply, they were interrupted by the store's head of operations, a woman named Dana who had driven in from the district office after Seal catching a word of the incident. She looked winded, apologetic, trying to piece together what had unfolded without saying the wrong thing. "We've spoken to Becky," she began quickly. "She's shaken, but she understands she crossed a line. We can begin disciplinary procedures immediately." "That won't be necessary," Clara said, cutting through the performance with the same precision as a chef slicing through rind. "Discipline doesn't teach. Perspective does." Dana blinked, caught between corporate protocol and something that felt almost like reverence. "Of course," she said eventually, stepping back. But the moment didn't pass quietly. Outside the office, employees were gathering, called not by alarms but by instinct. The story had traveled, without phones, without footage, through tone, glance, gesture. They all knew something had happened, even if the details were foggy. And when Clara emerged, they didn't scatter. They stood, as if waiting for confirmation that what they suspected, that the founder's daughter had been humiliated and hadn't vanished in shame, was true. Clara didn't give a speech. She didn't raise her voice or summon authority. She simply looked at each face not for names but for temperature. Empathy, awareness. And then she said, clearly, evenly, without artifice, "I'm not here as an executive today. I came to remember what this place used to feel like. I wanted to walk in like anyone could. And I did. And I was reminded of what happens when a space forgets how to see people. Silence followed, but it wasn't awkward. It was reverent. She went on, "No one here is being punished, but everyone here is being invited to look again, deeper, to taste what we offer, to question why we do." Her eyes didn't waver. Because if we stop offering welcome, we're just selling things. And my father didn't build a store. He built a place people trusted. That doesn't live in the product. It lives in how you hand it over. Julian stepped up beside her then, not to shield or overtake, but to affirm, to mirror. "You'll be seeing a lot more of her in the coming weeks," he said. "Not because something went wrong, but because she wants to help us remember how to get it right again." And that was how the shift began. Not with firings or apologies or headlines, but with the quiet return of a forgotten voice, a hand extended not in defense but in re-invitation, and the smallest nods of those who, without fully knowing why, felt something they hadn't in a long time. Pride. The next morning, the store opened like it always did. Early, quietly, with the hum of refrigerators and the soft beep of registers syncing like a morning heartbeat. But something in the air had changed. It wasn't visible. It didn't smell different. But the employees moved differently. Not faster, not slower, but with an awareness that hadn't been there before. The shift schedule on the break room wall now included a handwritten note beneath it, signed with a looping CE. It read, "Today is an invitation. Let's make sure no one has to ask twice to feel seen." No one removed it. No one joked about it. In fact, the marker used to write it had been placed reverently next to the coffee pot, uncapped, as if waiting for someone else to add to it. Clara arrived later that morning not through the main entrance but through the rear loading dock, wearing jeans, a soft navy sweater, and a staff apron she hadn't put on in over a decade. She didn't carry her access badge. She didn't carry her title. She carried a clipboard and a smile and a sharpness in her eyes that was not unkind, but clear. For 2 hours she shadowed Lacey at the cheese counter, not correcting, not testing, but watching how she offered samples, how she greeted regulars, how she remembered dietary notes for the older woman who came every Thursday with a cane and a folder of coupons. Then, just before noon, Clara did something no one expected. She asked for a team meeting, on the floor, among the customers, not in the back room where things could be softened by walls and filtered through managerial phrasing. They gathered around the floral section, near the seasonal honey display, where the light hit the stone tile at just the right angle to make shadows look forgiving. She stood with her apron still tied, her clipboard folded in one hand, and she spoke. Not like a boss, not like a victim, but like someone replanting a flag in familiar soil. "Yesterday," she said, her voice calm but resonant, "I was asked to leave, told I didn't belong, accused of pretending." She paused, not for effect, but because the memory still sat under her skin. The person who did that isn't here today. Not because she was dismissed, but because she was given time to listen. That's what this place used to be good at. Listening, and learning, and offering. She turned slightly toward Lacey. "This morning, I watched someone serve cheese the way I remember my father doing it. Slowly, personally, like it mattered. And that's why I'm here. Not to rewrite policies, not to hang plaques, but to bring that feeling back." Her gaze moved across the group. Cashiers, stockers, baristas, one elderly janitor who'd been with them since the opening week, and continued. "Our name is Evans, yes. But it was never meant to be a brand. It was a promise that we'd nourish more than just hunger." Behind her, customers continued shopping, some pretending not to listen, some not bothering to hide the fact that they were. And Clara, standing in the middle of the store her family had built, didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to, because in that moment, surrounded by people who now understood who she was and, more importantly, who they were in relation to her, not beneath, not beside, but within the same intention, the room grew still, and something deeper than apology, deeper than correction, finally took root again. Not control, not compliance, but care. A week later, the store felt different. Not polished, not transformed, not advertised as reborn, but softened. The tension that once hung in the air like invisible wires had thinned, replaced by something gentler, quieter, like the hush that follows a good rain. Customers still came and went. Carts still rolled along the aisles, but the rhythm had shifted. The floor staff moved with less performance and more presence. Lacey now wore a staff trainer pin on her apron. Not flashy, just stitched with care. And when Clara passed her by the dairy shelf that afternoon, she didn't need to say anything. The girl's smile said enough. Clara herself no longer came in under silence or secrecy. She visited regularly now, sometimes with a clipboard, sometimes just with a coffee, walking the aisles not as a supervisor, but as someone making sure the store breathed right. That afternoon, she stopped by the cheese counter. The tray had samples, carefully portioned, toothpicks aligned, with a handwritten card that read, in soft cursive, "Feel free to try, we see you." Clara reached for a cube. No hesitation, no scrutiny. She placed it on her tongue, closed her eyes briefly, then nodded once to herself. The same woman who had once judged her by her coat stood nearby now, holding a basket with tea and fresh bread. And this time, when their eyes met, she smiled first. Not out of guilt, but something closer to gratitude. And behind the counter, where Becky once ruled with clipped precision, stood someone new. Gentler, more open, greeting each customer with the kind of sincerity that didn't ask where they came from, only what they needed. Before leaving, Clara paused by the front window, where a small framed card now hung on the wall above the bench. It wasn't large or branded or promotional, just a simple quote, etched onto parchment and backlit by sunlight. It read, "Some come for a taste. Some bring the recipe. Know the difference. Respect both." No signature, no name. But everyone in the store seemed to know who had written it. Clara looked at it once, then stepped out into the street, scarf fluttering lightly behind her, the weight of the past no longer burdening her stride. The door clicked shut behind her, and the bell rang. Not sharp, but warm, like something homegrown, still ringing with purpose.